right, guys, welcome to Classic Auto Repair. Today we're looking at a 1980 Chevrolet Corvette. Hasn't been running for quite a few years. Looks like the last time it was registered was back in 2015. So this is another one of those cars that we get into the shop that's been sitting in storage or just again in the garage. It's a really nice car, exterior wise. It's got really nice paint on it. Body seems to be in pretty good shape. And this is the L-82, which has the, it's got the 350. Back in 1980, they were cutting the horsepower down quite a bit. So I think this one is rated right around 200 horsepower. I pulled the data sheet on it. It's one of the things we do when a car comes in for the first time. We want to tell the customer all about the vehicle. So we'll run the VIN and we'll pull all the information. In this case, it's an L-82, a 350 with a 230 horsepower. Woo, that's a lot, isn't it? Not back in the 80s, we had to deal with emissions and fuel, the fuel crisis. And so the cars that were being sold are going to be fuel efficient, even in the sports car lines, to meet the EPA standards. This does have the automatic transmission in it. And again, I pulled the block numbers on it. They had identification information. So one of those things that we do on these cars is, again, get an idea what we're working with. In the 80s, they used a lot of vacuum lines for the emissions, all the different controllers, the headlight doors, cruise control. Everything is driven by vacuum and not by electric motors in the 80s. So a lot of times what you find is you have these cracked hoses, or a lot of times over the years people will take the lines because they break and they'll cap them off, or in some cases they don't know that they're bad, and so the engine won't run because there's a huge vacuum leak. So on this car here, I'm going to go through our safety inspection with you, kind of show you what we found on the inspection of the vehicle to get it back up on the road, to get it to pass the Texas inspections, safety inspections, and we'll get this thing back and cruising in no time. So starting from the first thing on the list was the customer claims that it had a severe fuel leak or smell, and after getting up underneath the car, we found that the gas tank, and it's kind of hard to see, but up in here, the gas tank is leaking right up in there. I don't know if you guys can see it. The gas is leaking out of the tank from a rust hole and dripping down. And of course, inside of the tank is a bad gas. It has a definite smell that's different from normal gasoline. It starts to degrade and turn back to what it used to be, which is, you know, that crude oil that is that's pulled from the earth. It you know, when it's refined, all the nasty carbon and all that sludge is basically pulled from the fuel so that it can burn cleanly. And unfortunately, sitting year after year, not being flushed out, what happens is that you get a contamination in your gas tank. And in here you can kind of see the condition of the metal. So what we're doing here is we've already got the okay to completely replace the gas tank, the fuel sending unit, the hoses. We're going to put a fuel pump on it. What we did here by having the car running after this many years of sitting is we bypassed the fuel system and we hooked up an external fuel tank so that we could see how the condition was of the engine and what it sounded like. We hooked up this external pump, and unfortunately the carburetor did not have fuel filters on it. So here's a good example of why you guys need to change your fuel filters on a regular basis during your tune-ups. Recommended on these old cars. We do them about every 18 months at the minimum to get those filters swapped out. And what that filter does is it keeps that contamination that's building up in the gas tank keeps it from getting into the carburetor where you have those very small holes for the jets, fuel passages. All of that is very critical and sensitive to anything but fuel. So we took this carburetor off the car, rebuilt it, and installed it the same day. And we were able to get this engine to fire up so we could listen to it. It's got good compression. We won't really be able to check on leaks until we get her up on the road, start driving it around. But as everybody's mentioned in past videos in the comment section, when these cars sit, the gaskets, they dry out and they crack or they get compromised. And the next time that they need to seal off some type of fluid, whether it be coolant or engine oil or transmission fluid, what happens is that seal will fail and then you'll get a leak developing. On the Corvettes, it's very common back here on the valve covers, on the rear side of the valve covers, they leak and they drip oil down the side of the block. And we end up putting valve covers pretty much on every one of these cars that's been setting for a few years. The rear main also will usually be compromised. However, in most cases, that's too expensive to replace the crankshaft seal, because usually you have to pull the engine or the transmission out. In some cases, on these older Fords and Chevys, we have the tool that we can install the upper seal without having to remove the engine, which greatly reduces the cost. But that's on certain engines with certain types of crankshaft seals or main seals. Also up front, we get a comment up on the timing chain, the timing chain gasket, the seal, the oil pan gasket is real common for leaking, as well as the transmission pan. So that's kind of talking about that. Now on the motor side, again, it did sound good. The exhaust sounds good. So we go through a checklist on it, and I have made that list for this particular vehicle yesterday. And we're gonna go over a few items for the customer right now. So just starting from the beginning, I mentioned the fuel tank needs to be replaced and why. We're also going to have to get the fuel pumped into the motor. So that's your fuel pump that needs to be replaced, and the carburetor has been already overhauled. We'll put a couple of fuel filters in place, and that'll keep the fuel system working the way it should. And as you can kind of see here, there are a few missing parts, like the crankshaft vent tube. It's a steel tube that goes here. I have one ordered. It's missing the grommet that goes inside of the valve cover. I've got those coming. New belts. These belts have been on here for quite a while. I've got that on the quote as well. So let's see, going down my list, I start with the cooling system. And one of the things that I put on the list is the radiator. These radiators are kind of buried up in here. They're kind of hard to see. But on the driver's side, we can kind of see the calcium buildup, the oxidation that's happening from the aluminum and metal surfaces being exposed to just sitting and those leaks that it has. So the core is leaking here. We got a little bit of compromised here, and you can kind of see up inside of the core here that it's got some definite leaking occurring. So one of the things I would recommend is putting a new radiator in it. While we have the radiator out, we're going to go ahead and replace the hoses, get your belts on there. It has a new clutch fan on it, which is this part right here. That's new. And the water pump has been replaced at some point. So normally we would put a water pump on it if it's an original mile car. This one has been replaced, got a new alternator on it. However, the alternator was not wired correctly. We see this really, it's very common where people will just take electrical tape and they'll wire the wires together. And I think everybody knows that's watching this video that if you see wires like that, you're going to want to get them fixed, because that's going to create a problem right there. So we'll take all that, repair it, and make sure we have some broken wires. Like this is the temperature sender wire. This goes to the temperature sending unit on the engine block, and goes up to your gauge on the instrument cluster. And so that temperature gauge is not reading right now because this wire is not connected. Probably has a bad temperature sender, and we'll get that fixed as well. When we opened up, well, before I jump too far ahead of myself, let me wrap up on the cooling system. Again, we will flush out the system, put some new antifreeze in it, and then get that cooling system performing the way that it should. Moving on to the next item that was on my list. Hold on just a second, guys. So you can kind of see we do have quite a big list on this car of items that need to be, if not immediately taken care of, we can prioritize the list so we can take care of the safety items first. The things that need to pass inspection, we want to make sure that we're dealing with those as well. So on my list of items, I will break it down further with a priority list and what we need to address there. Going down the list, air conditioning and heating, that's not a critical safety concern. It's more of a comfort, but we do want to check and inspect. I checked the gas on this. It has been converted to 134A, but it does show signs that there might be a leak on this because it didn't have a whole lot of pressure. So when you have a dried out system, you got to be looking at what's going on inside of your air conditioning lines. We'll take them apart. We'll see what the state of it is internally. We'll put a new dryer, which is a filter accumulator, and it does what the fuel filter does on the fuel system. An accumulator or dryer does it for your air conditioning. It removes the fine particles so that they don't get caught in the small holes in the expansion valve where it gets really small there, and if there's any kind of contamination, it will restrict the flow of the gas and will make the system stop cooling. So the clutch looks like it's in good shape. We get a lot of them in here where the clutches are just wiped out. It's got bad compressors. We'll do some pressure testing on this one, hook up the gauges to identify it. But again, not mission critical. Main thing is that anything that's on the drive line, which is your drive belt, that it be in good shape and not restricting the motor at all by having a bad bearing or a clutch. And in this case, we're looking like we're in pretty good shape there. On the, let's see, going to the drivetrain and staying there, I mentioned the tune-up. It needs to have a tune-up because even though we got it running with a carburetor overhaul and some fresh fuel, again, with its setting as many years as it has, we recommend a tune-up on this car. So we're going to change the spark plugs. The wires have they're not original, as you can see here. It's missing the shielding that goes across the back here. It's a shielding that protects against the static that's created. These are fiberglass bodies, and this is a high voltage ignition system. So these electrical pulses will interfere with AM, FM radio frequencies. And one of the ways that they combat it on the Corvettes is they have in the early years, they have a metal shield that goes over the distributor, over the wires, and that just it lowers the amount of penetration of those signals into the vehicle. So we're going to do a tune-up on it, replace the spark plug wires, distributor cap, the rotor that's inside of there. We're going to replace the air cleaner filter, PCV filter. It needs a PCV valve, so not only the one that goes in the air cleaner, but also the PCV valves need to be replaced. They get gummed up and sticky, and we'll get those all figured out. We're also missing one of the intake tubes right here. If you remember the other 80 I had in here a few weeks ago, that anniversary 80 Corvette, it also needed these ducts. It's real common that they get torn or go missing, so we'll get that back installed on there as well. Again, just doing an overall tune-up. We're going to we're requesting to have an oil change so that we can look at the condition of the engine internally by looking at the oil and the filter. Then we'll swap that out with some fresh oil and a new filter to get everything ready to get back on the road there. On the back side of the engine, you got your transmission. The transmission was low on fluid, a couple of quarts, so it wasn't moving around as easily as it should. So we got the Dextron added to the transmission, and that was just temporary to get it to where we could move it around. We would recommend, because it has been setting, to go ahead and pull the transmission pan that is leaking. That's why we're losing fluid. Remove that transmission pan, replace the filter, flush out the transmission fluid, and put a new pan gasket on it to stop the leak, and new fluid to keep the transmission in good shape and shifting the way that it should. Going down the list on the electrical system. The electrical system, I showed you that alternator wiring. Well, there's a few cases of that where the circuits have been, where they're not working correctly or something is broken. Up here on the front of the engine, in 1980, they used an aluminum alternator bracket, and you can see right here the bottom of the bracket is broken. It's supposed to be connected right here to the alternator, and it's broken off. And what that's doing is that's creating a loose and moving alternator. So we want to get that to be able to tighten up on the belt so that it's producing a charge. And the way that we do that is by replacing that bracket. I have found them used on the internet. They don't make that part, and there's a cast iron version. However, the cast iron version, you do have issues with the aluminum valve covers, clearance and things like that as far as how the spacing is. So we're going to go right back with the original bracket, and that'll keep everything in alignment. Go ahead, as I said before, we'll replace the belts on this as well. So on the electrical side, we're looking at this. We did a load test on the battery, and I don't know if you guys remember on these cars, but the batteries are located in the back cargo area here, and this battery is dated 1220, so it's probably got a couple of years on it, but it's still cranking over, and it passed the load test, so we're looking good there. Let's see, continuing on the electrical items. The choke wire, which during cold conditions, the choke, electric choke, helps the engine start by restricting the amount of airflow that's going into the carburetor. And it's critical that that's working to get those cold starts and to improve the fuel economy. So we're going to check the wiring, make sure that we have an ignition source wire going to the carburetor choke coil that's on the side of the carburetor. We checked all the electrical systems, blinkers, flashers, things like that, and the hazard flashers showed to be faulty, so we'll check that for a flasher. The horn does not work, and that can be a couple of items. It could be a horn relay, it could be the horns. They don't tend to fail that much in the 80s, but it is common in the 60s and 50s to have bad horn relays, but probably more than likely, the problem with the horn has something to do with the button here, and that has something to do with this. Watch. Okay, so I don't think this is going to pass a safety test, and that is a concern, obviously, that we need to address. They have pivot points in these Corvette steering columns and a telescopic, and so it's a very complicated design. And it does fail because the joints in here have pins and screws that come loose, and or the holes get wallered out, and so that creates that looseness in the joint. And what we're going to do is take that all apart and service the the parts by rebuilding the steering column. And at that time, I can look at the contact points on the horn button, make sure that we're getting current through the switch to the button, and then find out what's going on in there with replacing some of those parts as well. The headlights are okay. I do have low and high beam headlights. The tail lights are good. License plate faulted. The problem with the headlights is even though the headlights come on, the doors do not open. And as I was telling you earlier about the vacuum systems, in the 1980s, they went really nuts over vacuum systems to control all the different moving parts on the vehicle. And in this case, in the 80 Corvettes, they use these big diaphragms that are controlled with vacuum, and underneath here are some controllers. These controllers basically act like a relay and use a vacuum source to port the vacuum one direction or another, which causes the headlight doors to open and close. As I mentioned, these hoses, there's so many of them, and you have a lot of diagrams that show sources and where the vacuum is connected. If one of these hoses has a crack in it, or a bad valve, or bad actuators, that will cause the systems to fail. And now all these hoses also go up into the headlight switch. The headlight switch uses a vacuum on the backside of the headlight switch to control the doors. And there's also an override valve so that you can open the doors and keep them open without the headlights on when you want to clean the headlights and stuff like that. Any one of those items can compromise the entire vacuum system of the vehicle and make certain parts not work. That also is true with the climate control, which the vacuum system controls whether the airflow comes out of the defrost, the vents, or on the floor, turns the control on for the heater to let heat come into the vehicle. All that's controlled by vacuum. And the same compromises will occur if the main vacuum source is not connected or compromised. Your headlight doors, your AC, heater, cruise control, things like that will stop working because the vacuum system's not holding vacuum. So, we'll definitely we have that listed on the estimate for repair as well to get those headlight doors opening and closing. Brake system. This is the master cylinder and brake booster. We opened up the brake, the reservoir here, and the front disc brake reservoir was full. The rear brake reservoir was empty. So that told us that we had a compromised brake system because the fluid wasn't in there. So we did some more inspections on the brake system, found the rear brake calipers were leaking from just setting over the years. The seals, again, those seals dry out, compromises the system. And so we're gonna have to put a set of new hoses, calipers, brake pads on the back of the car to get the brake system performing the way it should. Of course, once we get it on the road, we'll find out how the front brakes are working, but at least the front brake system is not leaking at this point, but it may start leaking once we get it on the road and start putting a lot of pressure on those brake parts. That's when they usually compromise. Brake hoses will start to leak or burst. We want all that to happen under our supervision and our ability to control the situation during our road testing. So again, real good reason to bring your vehicle to us when it's been setting for many years, is these vehicles can be very dangerous, and it takes a trained person to recognize some of the systems when they fail so that you don't create a safety concern, or more importantly, cause more damage to the vehicle through either an internal problem with the engine or transmission, or something that is going to fail and causes you to crash the vehicle. So get the car to us, let us do a no-cost free inspection on the vehicle so that we can create almost like a blueprint for the project, so that you kind of have different areas that you can focus on when your time and budget allows, or bring it all to us and we'll take care of everything there, give you back a vehicle that's ready to put on the road and start driving. One of the items on the interior inspection are the windows. The customer was concerned about making sure the vehicle was sheltered because the windows would not go up. And when our inspection, there's window motors inside of these door panels, and they are both needing to be replaced. So I have that listed to replace. They are available to put a couple of new electric motors in them, and that'll get it back going. That 80 I had in here a couple of weeks ago, it needed a driver's side window motor, and it fixed it right up. Excuse me. Going down the list, the stereo is non-operational. You can kind of see someone put this in here, and it really is pretty beat up, and it's loose and not fitting in the hole. It's just basically kind of mounted in here. So that probably needs to be fixed. It's got a broken panel right here. You can kind of see this plastic. This is all one piece. And it's cracked and broken because of the stereo. It looks like the stereo installation and the pressure cracked the plastic if it wasn't already there. There's a little bit of pressure right here on the control lens, and it's caused it to kind of warp. So that's not in the best of shape either. However, good news is that the clutch does get engaged on the air conditioning. The blower does work. So we're looking in pretty good shape as far as the control head is concerned, but I'll have to test it more once I get it up on the road. Again, this is almost 100,000 mile car, and you know, it's got a lot of miles on it. Well, we would consider a lot of miles, but really in the year that this is really a low mileage vehicle still, and in pretty good shape overall. Yeah, it needs a couple seat covers and some new carpeting. Door panels look like they've already been recovered. The T-tops and glass is in really good shape. One of the items I did put on the list was the tint. This is what happens to tint that's been on a vehicle for 20 years or more. It turns purple, and then it starts to peel and crack and tear off, and it just basically stops performing. It affects visibility. Looking out the back glass, you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. The film is just delaminating from the glass. So one of the items I did put on there is to remove all this film off the vehicle, because first of all, it's a safety concern at night. I'm sure you can't see out of the back glass, so we'll definitely take a look at that as well, as far as recommending. And that's something that the customer can do also. You know, some of these things require a certain skill set. Other items are definitely something you can do on a weekend and tackle yourself. Let's see, going down the list, we talked about the stereo. Interior dash gauge, we saw that was cracked. T-top weather strips right here, you can see that they're not in place, which is going to be a major leak if you wash the car or get it out in the rain. I did look at the visors. They're not available parts wise. You can only find old stock on these, and they're running about $350 per visor. So it may be the reason why they haven't put these back on there. This one's missing the arm, the spring, and the rod. This one has the rod on it, but no visor. So depending on what kind of budget the customer has, I can locate these and make sure they're the right color, or have them sprayed so that they're the right color and match the car. All right, getting close to the last page of the inspection. Of course, I covered the carpeting. We'll recommend the kick panels carpeting. The rear decks usually don't get, if you have a cargo cover like this one does, usually don't get a lot of damage back here from the suns with the tent and that cover being closed. But we do have an option at an increased cost, obviously, to put the rear cargo carpeting in as well. But usually the one that takes the most damage and wear from the sun and from using it for several years is the front floor pan carpeting. We'll pull the seats out, put some new carpeting in there. If it needs some sound and heat deadening underneath the carpet, we'll put that in as well. That helps with sound. But in the 80s, they were building a pretty good car. They already have pretty good insulation on the carpeting as well as underneath underlayment. Weather strips are in really good shape. They just need to be treated with silicone. I don't see any tears or cracks on any of these door or window weather strips, so that's a good thing. Either they were replaced at some point or just in really good condition. Mainly what it is maintenance items like your wiper blades. They're shot and need to be replaced. Things like a tune-up, oil change, transmission service. Tires are they look to be really new. They've got really good tread on them, like they were put on here recently. So we're looking good. On the tire side, we are missing one of the lug nuts on the driver's side front and rear wheel. So I have sourced the original lug nuts to replace those as well. And I think that's about covering it. I did have seat covers on here. I can get these seats covers available in this in this color of burgundy or red. It's like a claret, and I do have them listed so that we can remove these covers and replace the foam. Is not in bad shape, but we will probably have some of this damage repaired, and then put some new covers on it, and that'll get that fixed up as well. Overall, like I said, the interior is in pretty good shape. I have the bezels here listed. They have a crack. They always crack right here, and these are available in the correct color to replace as well. And that's about it for right now. Now, once we get it up on the lift, I can do a further inspection on the suspension components. But from what I can see so far on the bottom, from being underneath there with the gas tank issue, it looks just like normal serviceable wear parts, like the sway bar bushings need to be replaced. But the mechanical function and the suspension seems to be all in good shape. I may look at some replacing some of the shocks on this, depending again on the road testing and how the vehicle feels going down the road. And I'll have more information on that. Again, we ran the data plate on it so that we knew exactly what kind of motor we were dealing with, what type of trim, interior components, how the car was fitted with accessories. We can tell a lot from the build sheet and from the data plates, as well as the resources online to pull different diagrams, flow charts. And of course, we have all of our technical manuals from back in the 80s when we worked on these cars when they were brand new at the dealership. We have all of that documentation and resources available to us as well. And that's about it for this inspection on a 1980 Chevrolet Corvette. Thanks for watching. I know it's a long one, but it did have a long list. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.